Thank you, and thank you to all of you for sticking around. I won't keep you too long from the bubbles, and I hope to present something that's worth thinking about and worth talking about. Some of this material is actually based on my older work, and some will be rather new material on race and science and white identity politics. Thanks also to Stephanie and Baptiste and the organizers and for the invitation. It's been a very lively couple days. I'm sure all of your heads are exploding with insights and ideas. So here maybe are a couple more. Here's what I'm going to go over. I want to start by talking about the March for Science. Then I'll talk more theoretically about different conceptions of politics and about democracy and representation, about populism, and then I'll move into the material on race and science and on the idea of whiteness. So you might remember about a year ago, the March for Science started in the United States, but it became a worldwide phenomenon. I actually gave a talk myself at the March for Science in Sacramento. I was the 13th out of 13 speakers, and there were thousands of people there when it started, but by the time I went, there were only about 50 left. I was one of the only social scientists in the entire country to be a speaker. There were many social scientists who attended, but for the most part it was dominated by natural scientists, and so I got the crowd to give a cheer for social science, and I tried to bring in some STS perspectives on science and the March. I thought the March was a really excellent case study for thinking about two major issues that I'm interested in. One, the relation of science and politics, and the other, the question of race and diversity in science. Here's another picture. The organizers, after much back and forth, adopted the slogan that the March was political but not partisan. But as you can see from this picture, the participants did not agree, and in many ways it became an anti-Trump march. The question of diversity ended up being quite prominent in the United States. I don't know how it was in Europe. And it had been a major issue of debate prior to the march. The organizers, when they first announced their plans in early 2017, they were immediately criticized because the organizational circle was mostly white and mostly men. And to their credit, they very quickly made some adjustments, and they brought in women and people of color. They revised their website many times. They had included a diversity statement that they kept revising in response to more criticism. And in some respects, they really responded to the criticism quite well. And in many ways, it became the part of the anti-Trump element of the march was also about advocating for people of color, for trans people, for Muslims, people who have been very much under attack, especially since the Trump election. What I want to start with, though, is to look in a little more detail at how people talked about the relation of science and politics during the march, or in the lead up to the march. The very first statement was this: this is a protest, but it's not a political protest. One of the organizers said that in an interview. They backed away from that. It didn't really make much sense. What is that? A professor of coastal geology wrote this in a New York Times piece. He said that a march by scientists will serve only to trivialize and politicize the science we care so much about. And he said that for that reason he was not going to attend. And there are a fair number of natural scientists who were concerned that the march would politicize science, and therefore they thought it was a bad idea. Other people insisted that science is always political. Bill Nye said, "I just want to remind the administration, the Trump administration, that science is political. It is inherently political, just like everything else." And so there was this real back and forth about different understandings of the relation between science and politics in the rhetoric around the march. And this was something I've been thinking about and studying for a very long time, and I had just written a piece in Social Studies of Science on the issue. So I took this up and I wrote a short opinion piece that tried to address this in the context of the march. And I want to lay out a few distinctions that I've found useful in thinking about the relation of science and politics. One is, first of all, grammatical. To use focus on the idea that the word politics is a noun. And it historically has appeared in two basic forms in thinking and commentary on politics. One form takes the form of thinking about a political sphere. And this here I'm drawing on the work by the Kari Palonen, a Finnish political scientist. And he says when we use metaphors such as the political sphere, arena, field, these are all sphere metaphors, spatial metaphors, and they don't really tell us what politics is, they tell us where it occurs. And this way of talking about politics is still quite prevalent. If you look closely at debates about the role of science in politics, they often are not about what politics involves, but where it is. Is it in science? Is there politics in the university? Is it here or there? And these debates go back and forth without anyone bothering to tell us what they mean by politics. And I think in political theory, it's pretty widely agreed nowadays that there are no fixed limits to politics, that politics is unbound, it can appear anywhere, and especially in science and technology, maybe in this room. The other dominant way of thinking about it is in terms of activities, where people actually try to say what they think politics is, or more commonly, what politics does. What do people do when they do politics? And here you get, people say politics is partisan competition, politics is rational deliberation, politics is disrupting established routines. And we saw both of these in the lead up to the march, but often with a different formulation using the word political as an adjective, which I think has really different, two different meanings, and this actually appears in the Oxford English Dictionary. One is we say something is political when we want to say that it has origins, implications, or effects that are associated with politics. And the other, it designates an activity as a side or mode of politics. So we might say science is political in the sense of it has political origins. There are funding decisions about what kind of science to fund. There are regulations on science. And also it has effects and implications of what science gets funded, has impacts on society. And that's quite different from saying that there's politics going on as an activity inside science. And a lot of I think the disagreements about this come because people are using the word political in two very different ways. And yeah, my kind of effort to find some way of combining this is to say that not everything political is politics. Science can be political in the sense that it has political origins, implications, and effects. And that's relatively straightforward. It's not actually very controversial. What is more controversial is when people say that science becomes a site or a mode of politics, when there's politics going on in a place where many people think it shouldn't. One way to formulate this is to say that science can and should affect politics and be affected by politics without necessarily becoming politics. And this is part of a way of thinking about politics that emphasizes political activity as a distinctive kind of human activity, and that when we're doing politics, we're doing something different than when we're doing science or music or religion or art. These are all distinctive activities. They have distinctive norms and standards, distinctive institutions, and of course they might influence each other, but that doesn't mean they're the same. So I found this kind of a useful way of thinking about these relations, and then it raises a series of questions about our own work, my work, your work perhaps. Is your work political? Are you engaged in politics, and if so, in what context? And then to come back to the issues around diversity, are we engaged in what is known as identity politics when we are working in the universities, when we're producing knowledge or science? I'll come back to that in a few minutes. But that's kind of one of the core questions behind this talk. I want to now say a few words about democracy. I like to start with the etymology. Democracy is rule of the people. Both of those terms are extremely controversial and problematic. We'll talk more about the people in a moment. But I really think it's important to emphasize the element of rule, because I think so often when we talk about the democratization of science, we often end up with rather broad notions of cultural democracy. Democracy is kind of an ethos, or democracy as simply promoting participation or making things more equal, which is fine. Those ways of thinking about democracy are useful for some purposes. But emphasizing the element of rule emphasizes the point that in democracies we have to make decisions, and those decisions have to be enforced with coercive power. And that means that there will be winners and losers, and that when we're thinking about democratizing scientific institutions, we have to pay attention to those kind of real practical issues. Democracy, of course, is historically contingent and culturally diverse. There's no one single definition of democracy. Democracy is not an exclusively Western concept. There were, we often have this image of ancient Athens as the first democracy, but there were democratic practices in ancient Mesopotamia, in ancient India, in ancient China. And, I think scholars are slowly starting to develop a more global, cosmopolitan view of the origins of democracy. And then for me, what's especially important is to keep in mind that actual democracies today in rich societies are characterized by pervasive and systemic inequality. And I think unless we really acknowledge that and keep the various statistics in mind, when we talk about democratizing science, we're sort of missing a lot of what's going on, and our efforts are not going to really have much practical impact until we really address the extreme inequalities that most modern democracies are facing. Now a few words about political representation. It's come up a few times during this conference. I think representation is a human practice that's pervasive throughout society. There are different forms. There's representation in the sense of speaking for people. There's representation in the sense of making representations of nature or states of affairs. I would say simply that all politics involves the making of representative claims. And this means that we cannot really know if someone is a representative until we see what the audience does with the claim. So representation is a relationship. I think I mentioned the other day, at least that's how I think of it. And someone makes a claim to speak for others, and then we have to look and see empirically to what extent those others accept the claim. So representation we should look at in this circular manner. Representation is constitutive or performative, sometimes people say. It constructs the people. There's no, in modern societies, there's no pre-established people, but various groups and constituencies are constructed through not only politicians, but also civil society actors, interest group representatives, and even scientists and engineers. They are constantly engaged in constructing the people. And I think it's useful to think of representation as distributed across diverse institutions, so that different kinds of institutions involve different kinds of representative claims. And as I mentioned with regard to citizen conferences, this means that we should avoid expecting too much from any single institution. And then finally, I think of representation in a democracy as involving different elements, and this goes back to my book from 2009, to think of these different elements: authorization, accountability, participation, deliberation, and resemblance. And within that context, the rest of my talk today is really focusing on resemblance, on the notion that there's some kind of perceived similarity between constituents and their representatives. It might be merely symbolic. It might have to do with ideology, or it might have to do with demographic characteristics of race, gender, class, religion, etc. Resemblance, I think, should be understood as constructed through politics. It's often controversial. It's something that is often contested, but it is an important part, an important way that constituents have a sense of being represented. Here's one of my all-time favorites of this form of representation. Apparently there's a tradition in the White House in the United States that when an employee leaves their job, they get invited to the Oval Office and they have a short meeting with the president. And this was an African-American family that had been working at the White House for several years, and they came to the Oval Office and they had just a few minutes with President Obama, and there were two kids. So the older was about 10 or so, and the president asked them both if they had any questions, and the older kid tried to say something smart and ask him something about foreign policy, and the younger kid said, "I want to know if my hair is just like yours." And Obama, instead of saying yes, he said, "Well, why don't you touch it and see?" And this was a real moment. The fact that this kid wanted to see if the first African-American president had the same kind of hair he did, right? Very first one. And that's really what resemblance is about. So here's a chart that I wish I'd put in my book, kind of trying to get at this idea that different institutions potentially fulfill different elements of representation. And I'm not going to go through it in detail, but you can kind of see that we can apply different criteria to different kinds of institutions, if it's an advisory body or a legislature, stakeholder negotiation, and so on. Some are more participatory, some more deliberative, some reflect different kinds of perspectives, and so on. And then this then is a chart that gets at a real fundamental idea that I think often gets kind of lost in these discussions, which is a distinction between two kinds of legitimacy. And you see over on the left, we have the tradition of normative legitimacy, that a policy or institution should be accepted by the people. And I think this is where both lay deliberation and expert advice make their contribution. And they make arguments on, provide information that makes a certain decision or policy more justifiable. But we always have to keep that separate from the other question of whether the citizens actually consider it to be justified and what they actually think of it, right? And so this also, I think, helps us locate the particular contribution that citizen conferences can make. They contribute potentially, when they work well, to normative legitimacy, but then we have to take the next step and see whether the general public accepts their recommendations. Okay, so I want to say a few words about populism. There are a lot of different definitions of populism. It's also a contested term. I like the work of Jan Werner Müller and Pierre Rosenwald and Nadia Urbanati, and they emphasize two elements. Populist politicians and populist parties are anti-elitist. They emphasize a politics of common sense. They attack the mainstream media. They attack universities. And they attack certain experts. I think it's a mistake to say that they're necessarily anti-science. But the Trump administration, for example, has said that they want to develop new, unbiased, non-ideological climate science. And the leader, former leader of the AfD in Germany has said something similar. They don't reject all climate science, they just reject the IPCC because it's a globalist institution that's been captured by elites. But the anti-elitism element is very important. And then the other is an anti-pluralist element. With attacks on immigrants and Muslims and other perceived outsiders. And then most crucially, the claim that the populist leader is the sole authentic representative of the people, where the people is conceived as homogenous and as unified. If you go back to 2012 in the US, Sarah Palin famously talked about real Americans, and Trump often uses similar language. The UKIP and the UK Independence Party uses similar language as well. And And this then is where there's a real intersection, I think, between concerns about expertise and concerns about race and ethnicity. And that with the rise of increasing prominence of populist parties in both Europe and the United States, these two issues are really coming together in really important ways. So now then I want to turn to talking about race and science. Race is another very complex, controversial topic. Has very different histories in different countries. And my primary familiarity is with the United States. So whatever I say about Europe, I hope you take as a hypothesis, and I want to hear from you how you see issues here in France, especially. What makes it especially difficult sometimes is that the word actually gets used in different ways. I think for the most part in the United States, when people use the word race in everyday politics, it's pretty much understood as a social construction, as a social reality. In Germany, because of the legacy of Nazism, the word Rasse essentially, I think, still has a biological meaning and is therefore basically taboo. And you can talk about Rassismus in Germany, but you can't talk about race because it has that very different meaning of a biological difference, which does not correspond to scientific research. And then in France, you have this tradition of secular republicanism, and the French government doesn't collect racial statistics, right? And my understanding is, assimilation means becoming as French as possible to the point where race then doesn't matter anymore. But you'll have to tell me more about that. I had thought of going through various statistics on racial inequality. I think I'm not going to do that. The U.S. government is really dominated by whites. 90% of 90 out of 100 U.S. senators are white. 78% of the House of Representatives is white. The U.S. presidency has been 98% white, which is somewhat less than most presidencies, I guess, in Western Europe. And we could, mass incarceration, health disparities, education, infant mortality, unemployment, home ownership. Wealth is especially important in the United States. The average household wealth of African Americans in the U.S. is 20 times less than average white household wealth. And that just has enormous implications for all kinds of things. For Hispanics, it's about 17 or 18, I think, times difference. So that's in kind of the general society. Then there's the question of race and racism within science. Here's a few statistics from the U.S. Black STEM workers, science, technology, engineering, and medicine, are most likely to say they've experienced discrimination at work due to their race. This was a very recent broad poll. 62% of blacks working in STEM jobs say that they've experienced one of several forms of racism. 42% of Hispanics and 44% of Asians. And notice that that's higher than in non-STEM jobs. In non-STEM jobs, it's 50% for blacks, and STEM jobs, it's 62%. A majority of blacks in STEMs have experienced, this is the same, this then goes through different kinds of discrimination. And just a few other statistics in that regard. There was a recent report by the National Academy of Sciences that found that, hold on, where is that? No, I don't have it. Oh yeah, in 2006, fewer than 10% of STEM faculty at research universities were underrepresented minorities, and the percentage of women who are members of underrepresented minorities is even lower at research universities. The proportion of underrepresented minorities in science and engineering would need to triple in the US to match their share of the overall US population. So there's really pretty broad not only underrepresentation, but also broad discrimination within scientific institutions. And I found some similar statistics for Europe. I won't go through those. I had a little more trouble finding that kind of data in Europe, but it's out there. So now I want to go through a few kind of key concepts in thinking about this. First of all, of course, race is not a genetic category. There's a long history of scientific racism, of course, and race is increasingly coming back into genetic research in rather surreptitious ways. There's a wonderful book by Dorothy Roberts that really documents this very well, showing how scientists are using geographic ancestry as sort of a proxy category for race, but racial thinking kind of influences the way they use that category even when they don't use the term. Some people say, okay, well, since race is not genetic, it's not real. But you know, I think it makes more sense to say that race is a social reality, and social realities can have major impacts. Race is a product of racism, and this is a phrase you hear sometimes in literature. I think it's very useful to bring home this notion that race is a social construction. Racism doesn't exist because races exist. Races exist, were invented as a way to assert power and domination. Racism can be direct or indirect. It can be personal or impersonal. Oftentimes there's a overemphasis probably on interpersonal racism, you know, where if we eliminate that, everything's cool. But of course there are you know, long established inequalities that continue to persist even if no one acts in a racist manner. Seemingly neutral policies have differential impacts on different racial groups. And so that's how you can have indirect, impersonal racism without actually any racist actions or decisions by anybody. Cultures, ethnicities, and religions can be racialized. And this is especially important, I think, for thinking about race in Europe. In Germany, for example, I think a lot of times Muslim immigrants are treated in a quasi-racial manner insofar as they're treated as a homogeneous group and that has certain essential characteristics and that are deemed to be inferior or lower on a hierarchy. And if you kind of take those core elements as a definition of racism, you can have a racialization of ethnic groups or religious groups without them actually being explicitly understood as members of a race. Racial identity can be self-identified or attributed by others, and this is really crucial. That identity is a complex thing. It's partly how we think of ourselves, but it's partly how we're seen by others and treated by others. And it's especially important for thinking about white identity because, you know, I might not be racist, I might not identify as a member of race, and yet I might be treated by one, be treated as one by others, right? And the same, of course, for people of color. Whether or not a black person wants to be treated as black, they probably will be in contemporary societies. And then finally, whites also have a racial identity. And this is really one of the core ideas behind this recent work of mine. There's a long history of us kind of thinking of ourselves as the neutral standard. And I did this for a long time. I still do in some respects. We're not members of a race. People of color are members of races, right? It's parallel to the notion of gender. We tend to think of gender as applying only to women when men are also a gender. And that's important because if whites if we understand ourselves as the neutral standard, it sort of leads to a certain form of politics where whites don't have to change. We just keep doing what we're doing, and we maybe, you know, give people a hand up, you know, offer a little help to try and become more like us. And it ends up being a rather condescending, paternalistic form of politics. at least potentially. My real inspiration for a lot of this thinking is the author James Baldwin. And it's a pleasure to mention Baldwin in France. Who's ever read anything by James Baldwin? Okay, one person. All right, well, I urge you to run out and buy some James Baldwin. He's been experiencing something of a revival in the US the last few years. He lived from 1924 to 1987. He was a novelist, essayist. He fled New York, where he grew up, in 1948 and moved to Paris as a 24-year-old to escape racism in the US. He soon encountered other forms of racism in France, but he really constantly traveled back and forth between France and the US and Istanbul throughout his life. And he's really important for my work because throughout his writings he emphasizes the idea of race as a relationship that, or actually not just race, all identities are relational. He says that we define ourselves through our relations with others. What I say about you tells us more about me than it does about you. And there's a wonderful interview where he says, you know, that growing up, people would use racial slurs toward him, and he had to learn that it always told him about them. And he ends with the phrase, I give you your problem back. Racism is not something that was invented by people of color. It was invented by white people, and I give you your problem back. Here's another formulation of the idea. He said in an interview, before one can really talk about the Negro problem in this country, one has got to talk about the white people's problem. And I think, I mean, when I read this, it really shifted the way I thought about racial issues. And it's really then at the core of what I'm doing here. Let's see, how am I doing on time? Okay. So I want to talk just a little bit about white identity. Being white, it's not just about having light skin. It's not a fixed category. The membership of who counts as white has changed over time, right? In the United States, the Irish used to not be considered white. Jews, for a long time, were not white, and in some contexts still are not white, and sometimes they are. People from the Middle East, there's a whole series of court cases in the United States in the early 20th century. Judges deciding whether someone from India or Pakistan would be considered white or not white. So it's a social and political category. One way to define it is whiteness is a social system that grants statistical advantages to those who are socially defined as whites. So whenever I talk about whites, I mean people who are socially defined as white. In the United States, we have this notion of white privilege. I'm not sure if something similar exists in Europe as a phrase. I think of it in terms of two different dimensions. On one hand, various benefits, material benefits, psychological benefits, the benefits of being a member of the dominant group. And then more subtly, the absence of actual or potential harms, right? Not facing discrimination or abuse, and most importantly, not having to worry about it, right? Being able to walk into a department store and not worry if you're going to be followed because someone thinks you might steal something, right? Or going into a university classroom and not worrying that the professor might think, you know, that you're not going to do well because you're black. Right? This is called stereotype threat, right? And merely the potential for harm already has a severe negative impact on people of color in university settings and elsewhere. All this varies according to class, gender, sexuality, and other categories, right? Different whites experience their white identity in very different ways. Poor whites don't experience whiteness in the same way as rich whites. The advantages are always statistical, not absolute. Many whites suffer all kinds of injustice. It's not that all whites have to get it easy. I always have to emphasize that with my students. But whiteness does protect people defined that way from certain forms of injustice. Now, from a STS perspective, what's most interesting is kind of the epistemological elements of whiteness. Here's a quote from early 20th century author. The colored people of this country know and understand the white people better than the white people know and understand them. And this is a very common phenomena. Even Machiavelli talks about it, that people at the bottom of society always understand those at the top better than the other way around. They have to in order to survive, right? People of color are constantly watching, observing white people just in order to protect themselves. Baldwin also talks about this in very powerful ways. The philosopher Charles Mills talks about whiteness as a group-based cognitive handicap, involving all kinds of sort of cognitive problems that white people tend to face. We often have unconscious biases against non-whites. Non-whites also have unconscious biases, by the way, but whites have them somewhat more. We tend to have exaggerated self-assessment of our abilities and our importance. Whites tend to be ignorant about past and current racism. And most subtly, we're deprived of the contributions of non-white scholars and scientists, all the ones who dropped out of school or who didn't make it up to the higher levels in science because of various forms of racism. So, word or two about the 2016 election. There's a lot of debate after the election about what exactly caused Trump to win. And for a while, the most dominant explanation was it was the white working class. The white working class elected Trump, because of economic anxiety and insecurity. Ta-Nehisi Coates, a journalist, he did a careful analysis, and he came up with a different explanation. It was basically white people that elected Trump. Across income, gender, education, age, every single demographic group, Trump won. And he actually, if you look at income, he actually won by much more among middle-class whites than he did among poor whites, right? This was Trump's white populist coalition. I don't want to say things are the same with populist parties in Europe, but you can certainly, I'll show you a few pictures in a minute, certainly see racial appeals by certain populist leaders in Europe as well. Now, in the US, there's a tendency to talk about whiteness as only being either outright white supremacists, neo-Nazis, or white conservatives. The phrase white identity politics has actually become quite common in the US to talk about Trump voters. People who, over time, over the last 20 years or so, white people who have come to see themselves as victims. And there's actually a survey about 3 or 4 years ago that found that a majority of whites in the US now see racism against whites as a bigger problem than racism against people of color. And there's a real sense, because of affirmative action, because of immigration, there's a sense that whites are now the victim among kind of people on the conservative side of the spectrum. So for the most part, that's what white identity politics has come to mean in the US. I think it's useful to think more broadly, and I do this in terms of white paint. If you go and buy paint to paint, right, there's different kinds of white. So my dad actually came up with this. So there's bright white, which are the neo-Nazis and white supremacists. There's eggshell white, which are the white liberals, many of us. We'll talk about that in a sec. And then off-white are the white anti-racist activists. So the bright whites. These were the neo-Nazi protesters in Charlottesville last fall. Trump refused to condemn them. Here's an ad from the AfD campaign from last year. New Germans, we'll make them ourselves. And you see the nice white tummy there, making white babies. Colorful diversity, we already have that. And these are 3 white women from 3 different regions of Germany in the typical dress of different regions. So that's fairly straightforward, right? To condemn that version of whiteness. The eggshell whites are a little more difficult. And here, some of you might disagree with me. That's fine. I look forward to talking about it. The idea here is that there's a certain aspect of, or certain kind of white identity appears in liberal universalism and individualism. The idea that whites can define ourselves simply as individuals. I'm just me. I'm not white. Or as human beings. That we can go through life colorblind, that the best response to racism is to not see race, that the best policy is a politics of inclusion where we try to bring more people into existing institutions. James Baldwin said, why would I want to be included in a burning house? Right? If the institutions are pervaded by racism, then it's not enough to bring more people into them. And then very subtle psychological dynamics of guilt and what one author calls white fragility. That liberal whites often, precisely because we see ourselves as enlightened, we often react very defensively to talk about race. Sometimes in kind of excessive guilt, like apologizing for being white, which ends up making the issue about us rather than about the issue, or in very defensive ways, right? I know about that, I don't have to learn more, right? I have a black friend, leave me alone, right? And then being ignorant about the history of colonialism, of slavery, of the segregation in housing and healthcare, and kind of the ongoing effects of racism. Here's one recent study. This shows how whites have completely wrong information about the wealth gap. Over on the right is the perception of family wealth that whites have, the white perception of wealth of blacks. And the whites think it's over here, and the reality is way back there. Family income, whites think it's here, and the reality is there, right? So this is a broad survey. Average white Americans just have no idea about the extent of the racial wealth gap. Okay, and then we come to off-whites. Now this is on the one hand, it's a long tradition in the US of whites who oppose racism. And importantly, they oppose racism not just as individuals and not just as human beings, but actively identifying as a white person, saying, as a white person, I have responsibility to do something about racism. The tradition goes back throughout American history. It goes back to the abolitionists campaigning against slavery. It appears in England and Europe as well. But it's gotten more attention recently with sort of whites saying we have to do more to acknowledge privilege, whites working to join or help organizations of people of color, whites talking to other whites and saying, we have to do something, we can't stay on the sidelines with this debate. These are just from the last year from various protests. What will we do to change our legacy of violence? Whites getting involved in the Black Lives Matter movement, and so on. And I don't think like I said, there's a long tradition, but this seems to be coming up. One of the really interesting developments is a new organization called Showing Up for Racial Justice, and it defines itself as a white racial justice organization. And they host events and they raise money for various civil rights groups, and they have fairly detailed guidelines. It is a very precarious and in some ways a very tragic endeavor, because it involves a certain paradox that as a white person you continue to benefit from racism without wanting to, and yet you're trying to, at the same time, to do something about it. And things often go wrong, there's often misunderstandings, but people say it's worth trying anyway. I'm going to end now by showing you a short video, and then I hope we can talk about all this. This is Tim Wise, is a longtime white anti-racist educator. He's been doing this for 20, 30 years, and he has a film that if you're interested in this stuff, I really recommend it. And this is just a couple minutes from the end where he talks about the history of white anti-racist activists. And the first picture you see is from 1961, from the Freedom Rides, where northern white students took buses through the South in order to protest segregation of the interstate buses. And many of them got severely beaten, and this is one of them. So this is just a minute, 3 minutes or so.
Segregation must be stopped. It must be broken down. We're dedicated to this. We'll take hitting, we'll take beating. We're willing to accept death.
In addition to the typically pathetic way our history books address the contributions of people of color, very rarely is much attention paid to the average, everyday white folks who stood up and opposed injustice. People like Will Campbell.
FS units are already on duty on the grounds of Central High School.
Colored people here in the South have got better schools than some of the white kids like it is. Let them go to their own school.
Imagine how different the racial dialogue might feel for us if we knew of those white folks who opposed enslavement, who opposed segregation. Jeremiah Everts, John Fee, Helen Hunt Jackson, Sarah and Angelina Grimke, Robert Flournoy, Matilda Gage, Lydia Child. How helpful might it be for lessening our anxiety as whites and allowing us to embrace the multiracial future of America if we knew about the history of white anti-racism? What if we learned of the alternative tradition in our history, the one in which members of our community said no to racism and white domination and yes to justice, precisely because they realized not only the moral evil of those systems, but also because they saw both of them as cynical manipulations intended to divide and conquer working people, to keep us at each other's throats. People like Ann Braden.
The real danger today comes from the people in high places who are telling the white people that if their taxes are eating up their paychecks, it's not because of our bloated military budget, but because of government programs that benefit black people.
Virginia Foster Durr, Jay Wattice Waring, Constance Curry, Bob and Dottie Zellner, and Mab Segrist, along with literally thousands of others who in their own way have demonstrated that there is more than one way to live in this skin. It's a tradition that fits with the best of the American ideal and can elevate that ideal to a place far more concrete than it's been up to now. And if we do that, there's no reason why we as a committed and decent people can't move to a different place as a country.
Okay, and then here is a list of guidelines, and you can find these on the web if you go looking, guidelines of kind of how to do this within universities and other institutions, things to avoid, things to try, and kind of my question is, you know, to what extent does this make sense within universities and scientific institutions, and to what extent is this already happening to some degree in European countries, and to what extent should it happen more? So I'll stop there, and thank you very much. Look forward to your questions or comments.
Time for discussion. Question, discussion. Yes?
Thank you for your presentation. It was a nice overview. According to me, what you talk
Can you speak up a bit? I really
sorry.
cannot hear it here.
According to me, what you talked about, in France, it's only this discourse is, I find it present only in specific activist circles, like specific feminist circles, or even not in all feminist circles. Yeah, so it's really so it's present, but you have to find those circles where it's present. And in university, it's not a question I heard about it. So that question I know it only because of the activist circle, and not because of university. And so I think that you stress very important problem in university and in research. So yeah.
Okay, thank you. That's interesting. So, but you have heard about this in some activist circles in France.
Yes.
Okay.
But really
That's it. I didn't know that. That's
definitely not in university.
okay. Thanks.
And I think it's coming from US. I mean, this tradition, like now here, and we use we don't want to use race, so we use like social race in the activist communities, or racism. Now, like racism, we said racism people. You know, this like it's the way that you are. It's a race because some other people's see you like a black man.
Mm-hmm.
So we said like this now.
Okay.
I don't know if, I think that in US you don't need this kind of word because you don't really care about you don't have this difficulty.
So you invented a new word.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because
Yeah. How we can say it's racist.
But as you mentioned, in France, the grip of this Republican idea, and that, so we refuse to identify ourselves as like that. But we all know that. I mean, you know that this idea of Republican,
Right.
which is still strong, I think, and the fact that we can't have a statistic based on ethnicity and all that, even if we know the bad effects of that, or how it makes policies less easy to implement and all that. I mean, it's still very strong, I think, and so it's not surprising. So when we hear this kind of stuff for us, it's really, like you said, in very specific parts of societies, and it's not common at all to think like that in France. But we will.
This might come out a bit incoherent, but I was trying to say, because people were saying like in France, and I was trying to say about Cyprus, and I would say we are racist towards all kinds of people. Because first of all, we're racist towards Turkish Cypriots to the point where we don't actually recognize their existence. We don't recognize agency for them as a community. That's down to the politics. So even back in, when there was trouble, it was the crazy Turks. Of course, Cyprus comes from a tradition where there was Greeks and because of the British, there was Greeks and Turks in the island. So the Cypriot identity was something that had, people believe that it doesn't exist. There are people who believe there's no such thing as a Cypriot. Then we're racist towards domestic workers who started coming over in the 1990s. But however, we also have a weird relationship with British and other Europeans and other tourists, which is complicated because, for example, with the British, we were the colony of the British. So we send our kids to university to England, so we see them as more highly than ourselves. But we also see the tourists, which used to feed us, feed the economy, also partly because of depravities that the British do in Ayia Napa, like in beach resorts. as somebody to take money off, to cheat from, to cheat basically. So, and then we joined the European Union. It's these Europeans were imposing things, so we hate them as well, or sort of hate them and love them because they're going to save us. So we have all these things in an identity which doesn't come from a strong nation with a guilty, and we never regard ourselves as guilty or racist either, because we are the victims of a huge injustice, which is the problems, which is the way we are taught history, even though we try to ethnically cleanse the Turkish Cypriots. So that's, I don't know if that is it's not a question.
No, that's interesting. Thank you. Yeah.
That's an expose of some of the schizophrenia that led me into the jokes I was making yesterday.
Yeah, thank you. Very interesting to hear the second part of your lecture. But I would like to invite you to try to connect a bit more of this, the way you end with the politics of science and technology, about which you know a lot, of course. So, the last few days were a lot about participation and how difficult it is, or how foolish it is in general.
Yeah.
And do you think there's any potential for an off-white epistemology to improve that, or is the institution of science and technology so white through and through with its racist history as well that it's like?
Well, no. No. I think as different people with different perspectives have potentially ask different questions, and people, or I should say, with different life experiences, ask different questions and pursue different lines of research. Janet gave some examples with regard to gender, right? How the gender bias of American science created bad science in some ways, and in other ways simply didn't address certain important questions. And there's debates about whether race to what extent race is similar. But depending on the issue, certainly in social science, it makes a huge difference to have people from more diverse racial backgrounds doing the research. No example comes to mind immediately for natural sciences. Yeah. And then in terms of participation, I think the participation in science policy faces all the same challenges as participation in any other area, right? And so in that sense, not only making participatory venues more diverse, but also paying attention to the very subtle forms of exclusion, right? If you look at, sometimes with my students, I secretly count who raises their hand. And sometimes I keep track of who speaks longer, or who asks more questions and who makes more definitive statements. And when you start looking at those subtle aspects of deliberation, you start noticing gender and race differences pretty quickly. Not always, of course. It's a statistical, right? But those make a difference in any kind of participatory venue.
Yeah.
Maybe Hans,
Yeah, I have two points. A small technical point about the statistic you showed about the number of black people in STEM jobs in comparison to the number of black people in society. And I'm not fully convinced that this is a fair argument, because it would be fairer, I think, to compare the number of black people with a secondary school certificate, compare those with the number of people in the in STEM jobs. Of course, I think that's more reasonable. Of course, then you could start another discussion.
You go.
Why about the percentage of people with secondary school certificates? But then you have a different subject.
Well, yeah. I don't know why that's a different subject. You're going back. That's right. There's racism throughout the system.
Yeah.
and so you can't only blame the universities, for example. You have to look at the entire system. But at the end of the day, unless you accept some kind of genetic basis for race, you have to give a social explanation for racial differences or for discrepancies in representativeness.
It makes a practical difference. So what to do? So
it makes a yes, it does. Yeah, sure.
So that's my point here. So the second point is more theoretical, and it's about the definition of populism. Yeah. So populism now these days is used in a very negative way. Generally, it's seen as, and I think it's also in your talk. But your definition implies that elites cannot be populists, because you said they are anti-elitist. And so I think that is unfortunate. So I would prefer a definition of populism where it's not immediately clear which social group is populist actually. And so my view is that democracy has various elements that you also explained these elements from your book, and I would say populism is if you have only one aspect of democracy, namely votes. And so you don't have, there is not, say, real deliberation, laws, constitution is not important. And if you have this definition of populism, there are many cases of elites who are populists. And I think this is much fairer. If you look at Europe, for instance, I don't say anything about the United States. Criticism of the EU can be, say, motivated by very nationalist and very exclusive views, but it can also be motivated by saying the EU is really impoverished democracy. Really, if you look at all the regulations in the EU, and this is, for instance, I think what in the UK, Corbyn's view. And so the EU is not democratic, and all kinds of, it's technocratic. And so if you exclude, or if you always say, apply populism to not the elite, I think that is disadvantage.
Yeah, I mean that's certainly that's one way that in the literature that populism is defined as basically participation and an emphasis on participation in bottom-up politics, an emphasis on popular will. It's difficult. I mean, I think different definitions can be good for different things. The definition that I'm working with does not say that populists cannot be elites, but what it says that they present themselves as members of the common people. They present themselves as the only elites who speak for the homogenous people, right? So Trump is, he's our elite, and he's going to protect us from all those corrupt elites in the media and the universities and everywhere else. And the really core idea is this notion of representation. I think if you simply equate populism with kind of popular influence, then it becomes difficult to talk about democracy as having, giving a lot of emphasis to participation. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of complex, but I think this definition works pretty well to get at this, the way that populism really threatens a pluralist approach to political representation. But, well, we can talk about it more.
One last question, Benoit?
Yeah. I'm sorry if it comes out a bit messy, but I'm still trying to figure out how all those informations you gave us throughout this very good presentation might articulate. But to come back to your question, like, am I engaged in identity politics as a member of an academic institution? Here's my thoughts, just like this, I don't know. But if we interpret like the process of democratization as a fight against oppression, and if democratizing science is in some ways making science a side or mode of politics. And if politics necessarily involves resemblance and stuff, I think my intuition would be maybe we are engaged necessarily in identity politics, but not as academic, as a member of an academic institution, but maybe as white STSOs thinking about democratizing science. I don't know if it makes any sense.
No, that makes sense. That makes sense. And then, I mean, the question is then whether we make that more explicit, make the identity more explicit, right? You often, in presentations like this, you might hear someone say, well, you know, whatever, as an African American, I blah, blah, blah. Or as a woman, I think blah, blah, blah. It's not very often that somebody says, well, as a white man, blah, blah, blah. I didn't do that today. I've started to say that occasionally in my classes, and the students, actually 70% of my students are non-white. And I've had people tell me they really appreciate it. I don't know if that's the way to go in SDS, but it's worth thinking about.
And by the way, who wrote these guidelines, like white people in universities?
Oh, it's a combination of different guidelines that I found online, different organizations.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, we thank you again.
Bubbles. Thank you.